"Leave the thinking to the men, Miss Selwick," the Duke of Corfe said, and turned back to his maps as though the matter were closed. "The Leadwell water is an engineering question. You may tell your father's clerks that his lordship's daughter delivered his papers admirably, and go home." The young woman standing on the far side of the great oak table did not move. She had a bonnet in one hand, a leather case under her arm, and mud to the ankles of her boots, and she looked at him with the particular steadiness of a person who had already finished the argument in her own head and was merely waiting for the room to catch up. "My father is dead, your grace," she said. 3 weeks Tuesday. There are no clerks. There is only me and the plans and the fact that your weir at Leadwell will fail before the week is out." Cashen Thorne, 9th Duke of Corfe, had been told a great many unwelcome things in the 4 years since he had come into the title, and he had learned to receive them with an unmoved face. He kept that face now, but something behind it shifted, the way a floor shifts when a beam gives somewhere below. "My apologies for your loss," he said. "Your father was a fine surveyor. He was also a man who understood that a weir does not fail because a young lady predicts it." "No," she agreed. "It fails because the tail race was cut 9 inches too shallow in 1809, and every winter since has silted it further, and because whoever repaired the spillway last autumn set the coping stones flush instead of stepped, so the overfall now scours the toe of the wall instead of throwing the water clear of it." She said it pleasantly, as one might remark on the weather. "I looked at it from the carriage on the way over. One does not need to be a man to see a scour hole. One only needs to be looking down." Behind Cashen, his land agent made a small sound like a kettle beginning to think about boiling. The estate's engineer, Mr. Aubrey Pell, a tidy man with a tidy opinion of himself, laughed outright. "Coping stones," Mr. Pell said. "Your grace, I laid those stones. Flush, yes, and deliberately so, for a stepped overfall in that situation would be an extravagance." "It would be 6 pounds of masonry," the young woman said, "against the 400 acres of the Leadwell common meadow. If your grace considers 6 pounds an extravagance, I withdraw the objection and will say no more." There was a silence in the map room of Corfe Abbey. Rain moved across the tall windows in slow gray sheets. Cashen became aware that he was standing very straight, as he had been taught to stand when a thing wanted mastering, and that mastering was not going to serve him here. "Your name again," he said. "Honora Selwick." "Miss Selwick, you have come 9 miles in the wet to tell a duke that his engineer is a fool." "No, your grace." For the first time something like amusement crossed her face, quick as a fish under ice. "I have come 9 miles in the wet to bring you my father's survey, because he was paid for it, and I do not care to be in anyone's debt. Telling you about your engineer is a service I am rendering free of charge, which is perhaps why you value it so little." He should have had her shown out. Instead, he heard himself say, "Leave the papers." She set the leather case on the table. Then, from inside her glove, she drew a single sheet folded into quarters and laid it beside the case, squaring the corner to the table's edge with a precision that struck him, absurdly, as the most arrogant thing she had done yet. "The papers are my father's," she said. "That one is mine. It has the levels for a stepped overfall and a bywash to carry the flood water round the mill instead of over your meadow. Your grace need not read it. But when the wall goes, someone will ask what might have been done, and it will be pleasant for you to be able to say that you had it in writing and chose otherwise." She curtsied, not deeply, and walked out. The door closed behind her with a click that seemed to Cashen to go on for some time. "Insolent," said Mr. Pell. "Grief, no doubt. One makes allowances." "One does," Cashen said. "Send for the carriage to take her home. She will not accept it. Send it anyway. He did not touch the folded sheet for 2 hours. He worked at the rent roll, and at a letter to his sister, and at nothing much, and the folded paper sat at the edge of his vision like a stone in a boot. At last he opened it. It was not a lady's sketch. It was a section and a plan, drawn small to fit the sheet, with the levels written in a hand so fine he had to bring the candle nearer. Crest height, tail water, an estimate of discharge in cubic feet per minute at flood, and a note of the assumed velocity with its source cited to a treatise he himself owned, and had never read past the 2nd chapter. At the bottom, in the same small hand, if the toe is already undermined, no stone laid this winter will hold. Divert first, repair after. H.S. Cashin Thorne stood in his map room, with the rain going on outside, and understood, with a coldness in his chest, that he had told the only person in the county who knew what she was talking about to leave the thinking to the men. The wall went 4 nights later. He was woken at 3 by the bell and rode out with his coat over his nightshirt, and by the time he reached Ledwell, the mill leat had burst its bank, and the common meadow was a black lake with the tops of the hedges standing in it like drowned fences in a dream. 11 cottages took water to the first stair. A cart horse was lost. Nobody was, though a boy from the mill came near enough to it that Cashin went into the flood to the chest to bring him out, and stood afterwards on the bank shaking with cold, and with something worse than cold. At dawn Mr. Pell arrived, and began to speak of unprecedented rainfall. 9 inches, Cashin said. Mr. Pell stopped. The tail race, Cashin said. 9 inches too shallow, cut in 1809. Is it so, or is it not? Mr. Pell's mouth worked. One would have to measure. Then measure, and when you have measured, you will find Miss Selwick waiting on the answer, because she measured it from a moving carriage. He turned his horse. I am going to Ashen Cross. Selwick's cottage stood at the edge of Ashen Cross village with a yew hedge, and a brass plate by the door that said J. Selwick, surveyor, and had not yet been taken down. She opened the door herself with her sleeves pinned back and a smudge of ink on her wrist, and looked at him, and at the state of him, and did not say the obvious thing. How many houses? She asked. 11, no lives. The mill boy. How do you know about the mill boy? Because he sits on the wall to fish, and I told him twice not to. She stepped back from the door. Come in, your grace, you are dripping on my step, and if you faint in the lane, the parish will have it that I poisoned you. He came in. The front room was a workshop, a drawing board on trestles, a case of instruments with one brass theodolite gone dull with use, shelves of rolled paper, and a fire that had not been lit long enough to be warm. She put the kettle on the hook and did not fuss over him, which he found he was grateful for. You were right, he said. I have come to say it plainly, so that there can be no doubt of it later. You were right and Pell was wrong, and I preferred Pell because he was a man, and I was in a hurry. 11 families paid for that preference. Honora Selwick stood with her back to him, a moment longer than the kettle required. That is a better apology than I expected, she said. It is not an apology. It is a statement of account. He set his hat on the table. The apology is this. I am sorry, Miss Selwick. I was insufferable, and being a duke does not make insufferable into anything else. It only makes it expensive for other people. She turned round. Her face had lost some of its armor. Then we are agreed on the facts. What do you want? You. The word came out flatter than he had meant it, and he saw her eyebrows go up, and felt his ears grow warm, which had not happened to him in 20 years. To work, he said. I want you to work. There are 800 acres of low ground between Ledwell and the Corfe marshes, and every yard of it belongs to me, and every winter it drowns a little further, and I have been told for 4 years that it cannot be helped by men who did not trouble to look down. I am asking you to draw me a scheme. Levels, cuts, sluices, a bywash, whatever is wanted. I will pay you what I would pay any engineer, and I will pay it whether the scheme is built or not. You would be laughed at. Constantly, he agreed. By men whose meadows are underwater. Miss Selwick, I find I can bear it. She was quiet. The kettle began to whisper. There is a difficulty, she said. I have no name. My father had a name and it was his. If I sign a plan H. Selwick, every man on your estate will assume it is my father's ghost or my father's apprentice, and when they discover otherwise they will not build it. Not out of malice, out of embarrassment. Men will drown a village sooner than be embarrassed. Then they will be embarrassed, Cashin said, and they will build it because it is my money and my land and my order. That will make them hate me. Yes. You might have lied about that. You would have known, he said, within the hour, and then you would not have trusted anything else I said, and I find that I would mind that a good deal. Honora Selwick looked at him for what felt like a long time. Then she lifted the kettle off the hook, and poured and said, 2 shillings the day and my instruments repaired at your expense, and you will come with me to the ground yourself, your grace, because, when they see the Duke of Corfe holding the other end of my chain, they will find their embarrassment more manageable. Holding your chain. Someone must, she said. It is not skilled work. I am told men excel at it. He laughed. It surprised him more than it surprised her. It came up out of some room in him that had been shut since his brother died, and left him a coronet and a county, and no one at all to be foolish in front of. She smiled into her cup, and the rain went on, and somewhere in Cashin Thorn a decision was made that he would not admit to for a long while yet. They began the next Monday. She walked the marsh in a gray wool gown with the hem let down and mud to the knee, and she made him carry the staff, and she called out figures which he wrote in her book, because she said his hand was legible, and hers was small. It took him 3 days to stop being a duke on the ground and become, simply, the second pair of hands. It took him a fortnight to understand what she was doing. She was not draining the marsh. Every scheme he had been shown in 4 years had proposed to drain it, at enormous cost, into a river that could not take the water. Honora Selwick proposed instead to let the marsh drown on purpose. There, she said, on a cold, bright afternoon, planting her boot on a hummock. 60 acres, the worst ground you own, worth nothing but snipe. Bank it, put a hatch at the low end, and when the Ledwell comes down in flood, you open the hatch and fill it. You give the water a room to sit in. It sits there 4 days, it does no harm, and then you let it away slow through the mill leat, and the mill has water in a dry August besides. She squinted at him. Your grace has gone very still. Have I offended? No, Cashin said. I am thinking that I have paid £400 in surveys to be told to dig, and a surveyor's daughter has told me to wait. Water is patient, she said. It is a great deal cheaper to be patient with it than to fight it. Most things are. He looked at her. The wind pulling strands of dark hair loose, the chapped hands, the absolute absence of any wish to be admired. And he thought, quite clearly and with some alarm, that he had never in his life met anyone he would rather be standing in a bog with. The county found out by the middle of December, and the county was delighted. It came to Cashin first as a joke repeated to him kindly at the magistrate's dinner by Sir Holly's Vane, who thought he was being generous. They are calling her the Duchess of Ditches, Sir Holly said. No harm in it, Corfe. A pretty eccentricity. Every great man is allowed one. She is not an eccentricity, Cashin said. She is an engineer. She is a young woman of no family walking your marshes, without a chaperone. She walks them with her aunt, who sits on a shooting stick at the field gate and knits, and with me, and with 2 of my laborers, and with a theodolite. Cashin set down his glass. If the county wishes to be scandalized, let it be scandalized by the 11 cottages that took water in November, while my engineer explained that rain was unprecedented. That silenced the table for a course and a half, and cost him nothing, and he discovered afterwards that it had cost Honora a great deal. The vicar's wife stopped calling. The subscription library at Ashen Cross found that her father's ticket had lapsed. A girl she had grown up with crossed the street. She did not mention any of it. He learned of it from his own housekeeper, who had it from the carrier, and when he taxed Honora with it on the bank of the New Cut, she only looked at her book and said, "It is the price of the work. I knew the price. Please stand at the mark, Your Grace. You are 2 feet upstream of where I want you." "Miss Selwick." 2 feet, Your Grace." He moved 2 feet. But that night, he sat in his library with the fire down to embers, and thought about the shape of a life in which a woman could be made an outcast for knowing the discharge of a river, and about his own part in building that shape, and he did not enjoy the thinking. In January, he brought his aunt down from town. Lady Sabine Thorne was 71 years old, had buried 2 husbands and outlived most of her enemies, and could quell a drawing-room by adjusting her shawl. She arrived at Corfe Abbey in a fur-lined traveling cloak, listened to the entire story without interruption, and said, "Show me this ditch." They took her out in the estate cart, which she declared the most vulgar conveyance she had ever consented to, and stood her at the head of the new bank, where 60 acres of Snipe Bog lay glittering under a skin of ice. Honora, called in from the cut with mud to her elbows, made her curtsy, and braced herself visibly for the verdict. "You propose to flood it," Lady Sabine said. "On purpose, my lady. 4 days in the year, perhaps 5. "And the tenants?" "They lose the snipe. They keep the hay off the common meadow, which is worth £900 a year to them and to his Grace jointly, and the mill keeps turning in August, which is worth their bread." 900, said Lady Sabine. "You are certain of the figure?" "I am certain of the acreage and the yield. The price of hay I have taken at the 10-year average and shown the working, my lady, so that anyone who dislikes my figure may substitute his own." There was a pause. Lady Sabine turned her head very slightly towards her nephew. "Cashin," she said, "she has shown her working." "She always does." "Then I shall be requiring her at dinner on Thursday," said his aunt, "and I shall be requiring the county as well, and we shall see who cares to laugh at my table." She prodded the frozen bank with her stick. "Duchess of Ditches, what a poverty of imagination this county has. In my day we could insult a woman with some elegance." The dinner on Thursday was, by the standards of Corfe Abbey, a small one. 18 at table, the magistrates and their wives, the vicar, Sir Hollis Vane, and Mr. Aubrey Pell, who had not been dismissed, because Cashin had discovered in himself an unwillingness to ruin a man for being ordinary. Honora came in a gown of dark green that had plainly been made over from something older, with her mother's garnet cross at her throat, and her hair done by somebody who had tried very hard. She looked, Cashin thought, entirely out of place and entirely unbothered, which was a combination he had not previously known to be possible. He had put her on his aunt's right. He had put himself where he could watch. It went well for an hour. Then Sir Hollis, warm with claret and good intentions, said, "Mr. Pell, you must tell us of this scheme of yours at Ledwell. A reservoir, I hear. Very ingenious." Cashin felt his own hand tighten on the stem of his glass. Mr. Pell inclined his head. One does what one can, Sir Hollies. The principle is simple enough. One gives the flood a chamber, as it were, and releases it at leisure. I had it in mind some time since. Naturally, there has been assistance in the leveling. He smiled down the table, and it was not even a malicious smile, which somehow made it worse. Miss Selwick has been most diligent with the chain. The table made an approving noise. Somebody said that it was charming to see a young lady usefully employed. Cashin opened his mouth. Under the table, entirely without ceremony, Honora Selwick set 2 fingers on his wrist. It lasted perhaps a second. It stopped him as effectively as a hand on a bolting horse. "Mr. Pell is too modest," she said to the table pleasantly. "The principle is not simple at all, and he will not want the credit for the part of it that is difficult. Mr. Pell, forgive me, the company will think me impertinent, but I have argued with you about this for 6 weeks, and I cannot bear that you should be blamed for my error." She turned her wine glass a half-turn. "You held out for a chamber of 40 acres. I insisted upon 60. Would you be so good as to explain to Sir Hollies why 40 would have been sufficient? Because I have never been able to make the arithmetic come right, and if you can, His Grace will save £200 in banking, and I shall be very glad to be corrected." The silence that followed had a texture to it. Cashin had heard silences in the house and silences at gravesides, and had never heard one quite like this. "The arithmetic," said Mr. Pell. "The discharge at flood, sir. You gave it as 1100 cubic feet the minute. I make it 1900. Somebody is wrong by 800, and 800 is the difference between a full chamber and a drowned village." She looked at him with what appeared to be genuine hope. "Do you have your figure with you? I should so like to see how you got it." Mr. Pell did not have his figure with him. Mr. Pell, it became clear over an excruciating 90 seconds, had never had a figure at all, because Mr. Pell had read the 1100 off a table in a treatise that assumed a channel of quite different section, and had not gone to the ground to check it, and had said the word ingenious to a baronet. "I believe," said Lady Sabine into the wreckage, "that we shall not have the fish after all. Miss Selwick, you will oblige me by explaining the 1900. Slowly. Sir Hollies has never in his life been made to follow an argument, and it will do his constitution good." Honora explained it. She explained it in 11 minutes, without condescension and without a single flourish, drawing the section of the leet on the back of the menu card with a pencil borrowed from the vicar. And when she had done, Sir Hollies Vane put down his knife and said, in the voice of a man who has had a window opened in a stuffy room, "Good God! It is only sums." "It is only ever sums, Sir Hollies," she said. "That is why it is so unkind of people to keep them from us." Cashin watched Mr. Pell leave early, and felt for him about as much as he could spare, and went on watching Honora Selwick be handed the salt by a woman who a fortnight before had refused to acknowledge her in the street, and understood that something had turned and would not turn back. Later, when the carriages had gone, he found her in the map room, still in the green gown, standing over the great plan with a candle in her hand. "You might have let me speak for you," he said. "You would have thundered." She did not look up. "A duke thundering on my behalf tells the county that I am your property and my figures are your whim. A duke sitting quiet while I ask a civil question tells them the figures are mine." She moved the candle along the line of the new cut. "You were very good. It must have been like holding a horse at a gate." "It was like holding 2 horses. Yes, I felt the second one." She said it lightly, and then went a little still, because she had admitted to the 2 fingers on his wrist, and so had he. The candle flame stood straight up in the still air of the room. Cashin was aware of the distance between them, 3 feet of oak table, which was nothing, and everything else, which was a great deal. "Miss Selwick," he said, "when the scheme is built, the flood of 1811 will be the last one anybody talks about, and I shall look for work in another county, and your Grace will find that his aunt has invited a great many suitable young women to stay." She set the candle down. "That is how it goes. I am not complaining of it. I have had the best winter of my life, and I have you to thank for it, and I would rather not spoil it by pretending to either of us that it is something other than what it is." "And what is it?" "Work," she said. "Good work, well paid, with the only man in England who ever handed me the other end of a chain." She curtsied and went out, and Cashin Thorne stood in the map room a long while, looking at a plan he could now read in the dark, and thinking that in the whole of his life nobody had ever told him a thing so completely and so obviously untrue. In February, he did 2 things without telling her. The first was to send her theodolite to the best instrument maker in Marchcombe, with instructions that the dull brass was to be left dull, because it had been rubbed dull by her father's hands, and she would not thank anyone for polishing him off it. Only the horizontal plate was to be recut, and the tangent screw replaced. It came back on a Tuesday, and she took it out of its case in the middle of the yard, and looked into the telescope, and then stood there for a while with her back to everybody. The second thing was harder, and he did it at some cost to his dignity, which he was learning to spend. He went round the 11 cottages at Ledwell, one at a time, on foot, and sat in each of them, and said that the flood had happened because their landlord had preferred the opinion of a comfortable man to the evidence of his own eyes, and that they were owed the repairs and the rent forgiven and the truth, and that the truth was that a young woman had written the whole of it down before it happened, and he had not read the paper. He did not tell them to be kind to her. He only gave them the facts and let them arrange their own conclusions, having lately discovered what it was worth to be trusted with facts. The conclusions arrived at his gate a week later in the form of a deputation. The miller, 2 shepherds, a widow named Mrs. Threadgold, and a delegation of small boys who had been strictly forbidden to come, and had come. "We would speak to the lady, your Grace," the miller said, "not to you, begging pardon." Cashin sent for her, and then, with an effort, went away and stood at the far end of the terrace where he could see and not hear, which he considered one of the more difficult things he had done that winter. They had brought her a spirit level. It was a poor thing, a joiner's level in a beech stock, the glass a little clouded, and the miller had burned her initials into the wood with a hot wire, crookedly, and beneath them the word LEDWELL. Mrs. Threadgold had made her a pair of woolen mittens with the fingers cut off, on the reasoning, correctly arrived at, that a person who wrote figures in the open in January would want her fingers and would also want her knuckles. Honora Selwick shook every hand, including all of the small ones, and asked the boys which of them had sat on the wall to fish, and made the guilty one show her exactly where, and told him that he had been more use to her than the whole of the parish vestry, because he had told her where the deep water was, and gave him the job of watching the new cut for slumps at a penny the week. Then she came back along the terrace with the level under her arm and the mittens on, and stopped in front of Cashin, and did not thank him for any of it, because she knew that being thanked would have been a way of making it his. "Your Grace," she said, "there is a boy at Ledwell in my employ at a penny a week, and I shall be adding it to your account." "Approved." "He is 9, and he cannot read a rule." "Then teach him," Cashin said. "I am told it is only sums." She looked at him for a moment with the wind pulling at her hair, and something in her face gave way a very little, the way ice gives at the edge of a pond before it gives anywhere else. It is only ever sums, she said, and went into her drawings. And outside, unremarked by anyone, the wind had swung round into the south, and the first water was moving under the snow on the hills. The thaw came 3 weeks early, and the scheme was not finished. Cashin was at breakfast when the head-keeper came in without knocking, hat in hand, and said that the leadwell was running the color of tea and rising a foot the hour, and that the bank of the new chamber stood at 4 feet, where the plan called for 6, and that the hatch had no gate in it, because the ironwork was still in the founder's yard at Marchcombe. He was in the yard in 4 minutes. Honora arrived on a borrowed cob 11 minutes after that, riding astride with her skirts bunched and her hair coming down, and did not apologize for either. "How high?" she called. 14 inches since dawn. Miss Selwick, the hatch." "I know about the hatch. Listen to me." She slid down and came to him, and she was frightened. He saw it and was glad, because it meant she was not pretending. "The chamber will hold if we do not ask it to hold everything. 4 feet of bank will take 4 feet of water. That is 30 inches less than I wanted, which is about a third of the volume. So we do not send the whole flood into it. We split the river." "Split it." "At the old fish weir above the mill. There is a hatch there already. It is rotten, but it is there, and a dry channel behind it that ran to the tannery before the tannery burned. If we open that hatch and cut the head of the dry channel, we put a third of the water down the old tannery cut, into the chamber, and the rest goes on down the leat as it always has. Neither carries enough to break. Both together carry the flood." She was already pulling her book from her pocket. "It wants the cut opened 40 feet and 3 feet deep, and it wants it by nightfall. 40 feet of cut in a day. With 12 men, no. With 100, yes." Cashin looked at her. Behind them the yard was filling with men who had come without being sent for, because they had all been in the water in November. "You shall have 200, he said. He got them by 11 o'clock. His own laborers, the mill hands, the quarry gang from Ashen Cross, farmers who left their own beasts to do it, boys with turf spades, the blacksmith's brother, the vicar in gaiters and Sir Holly's vane, who arrived at noon in a coat worth more than a cottage and took a shovel from a 14-year-old, and used it badly, for 6 hours, and never said one word about eccentricity again. Honora Selwick set out the line of the cut with pegs and a length of twine, and then stood in the middle of the wet field and ran it. And Cashin, who had commanded 300 men in his time and knew what command looked like, watched her do it and felt something in his chest go over like a wave. She did not shout. She went from gang to gang. She told the quarrymen where to throw the spoil so that it made the bank instead of blocking it. She sent for hurdles and had them staked across the mouth of the cut so that the water could not come in and undo the work while the work was being done. And she took them out herself, in the dark, wading to the waist with a rope round her middle and the other end round the trunk of an alder and Cashin's hands on the rope. The water went into the old tannery cut at 8 minutes past 7 in the evening. Cashin heard it before he saw it, a long, low sound, like a held breath let go. Then the lanterns showed it running black and glossy along the new channel, out across the 60 acres of snipe bog, spreading, slowing, sitting down. By 10 o'clock the leadwell had stopped rising. By midnight it had dropped 3 inches. Not one cottage took water. Nobody was lost. The mill turned all night because the miller could not sleep and would not stop it. They stood on the bank at the low end, the 2 of them, with the flooded chamber going out silver under a rag of moon, and 200 people cheering somewhere behind them in the dark. 6 feet next year, Honora said. Her teeth were chattering. And an iron gate, and I want the spoil dressed with turf, or it will slump in the first frost, and your grace will please write to the founder at Marchcombe in terms that I could not use in front of my aunt. Miss Selwick, and the level of the sill wants. Honora. She stopped. He had a good many things arranged to say. He had arranged them over several weeks, in the manner of a man used to preparing a case, and standing there in the ruin of his boots, he found he could not remember a syllable of any of them. In November, he said, I stood in a warm room and told you to leave the thinking to the men. I have been ashamed of that sentence every day since, and tonight I am something worse than ashamed of it, because tonight 200 people did the digging, and one person did the thinking, and it was not one of the men. You held the rope. Yes, I held the rope. That is my whole contribution, and I would not trade it for the county. He took a breath. I am going to ask you something, and I want you to understand first exactly what is being asked, because you have been treated all winter as though your understanding were optional, and I will not do it again. I am not asking because you have saved my meadows. I am not asking out of gratitude, which is a cold thing and wears out. I am asking because there is no room in my life that you have walked into that has not been better afterwards, and because I have discovered that I do not want to hold the other end of anybody else's chain, and because when you tell me the level of a sill, I would like to be the man who is entitled to listen to it for the next 40 years. Honora Selwick stood very still on the bank of her own reservoir, and the water made its small, patient noises, and she said, in a voice not at all steady, You cannot marry a surveyor's daughter. I am aware of the difficulty. It is 30 inches short of what is wanted. We shall split the river. She laughed a wretched, hiccuping, entirely undignified laugh, and put her muddy hands over her face, and when she took them down she was crying, which he had never once seen and hoped never to see again for a bad reason. They will say I trapped you. They will, and then they will look at the meadow and at the mill and at their own dry stairs, and they will find that they have nothing to say that is worth the breath. Honora, I am not asking you to stop. I am asking you to sign the plans in your own name and hang them in my map room and be argued with at my table by better men than Pell. If that is not what you want, tell me now, and I will never say another word of it, and you will have your 2 shillings the day until the day I die. 2 shillings, she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her wrist and making it worse. You are a very bad negotiator, your grace. Cashin. Cashin. She said it as though testing whether a beam would hold. Then she looked up at him. Yes, yes, and I want it written down that I said yes on the bank before the ironwork came, so that nobody can ever say I waited to see whether the scheme worked. He laughed and pulled her in, and kissed her there in the cold with 200 lanterns bobbing behind them, and the flood sitting quietly in its room where she had put it. And somewhere in the crowd, the blacksmith's brother began, tunelessly, to sing. They were married in the spring, in the little church at Ashen Cross rather than the great one at Corfe, because the vicar at Ashen Cross had dug 40 feet of cut in his gaiters and had earned it. Lady Sabine wore purple and wept in a manner she afterwards denied. The county came. All of it came, including the vicar's wife, who had rediscovered her acquaintance with the bride in February, and whom Honora received with a serenity that Cashin privately thought the most terrifying thing about her. Mr. Aubrey Pell came too. He had written, 3 days after the thaw, a letter that had cost him more than money. I have been 40 years in this trade, and I read my figures out of books. Yours were got with your boots. If Miss Selwick will have an assistant who can be taught, I am at her disposal. Honora had him taught. He went on to be, by all accounts, a competent man, and told anyone who would listen that he had once been publicly corrected at the Duke of Corfe's table, and that it was the best thing that had ever happened to him. The chamber at Ledwell filled 6 times in the next 11 years, and the common meadow never drowned again. In the map room at Corfe Abbey, the great plan hung framed above the fire, and in the corner of it, in a small fine hand, it said, H. Thorne, Duchess of Corfe, from a survey by J. Selwick, her father. Cashin had wanted her name larger. She had refused on the ground that a plan should be read for its levels and not for its signature, and he had given way, as he generally did, and told her so frequently, as a grievance. They had 2 daughters and a son. All 3 could set out a line with a chain and twine before they were 10, and the youngest, at 8, informed a visiting earl at dinner that his opinion of the drainage of Corfe was inconsistent with the rainfall, and was sent from the table for it, and found a slice of seed cake on her pillow, and never learned which of her parents had put it there. And once, on a wet November evening years afterwards, Cashin Thorne came into the map room and found his wife bent over a section with the candle pulled close and her hair coming down, exactly as she had been on the first night, and stood in the doorway not saying anything at all. She glanced up. You are hovering. I am admiring. It is a culvert. It is a culvert, he agreed, designed by the cleverest person in England, whom I once instructed to leave the thinking to the men. He crossed the room and set his hand over hers on the paper. I have never in my life been so glad to have been so thoroughly, so publicly, so permanently wrong. Honora turned her hand over under his and held it, and did not stop looking at the levels, and said, Then hold the candle, your grace. Someone must.